When we talk about monsters in American history, we like them easy to spot: hooded Klansmen, burning crosses, snarling crowds. But the truth is more complicated. Sometimes hate wears a suit and a grin. Sometimes it stands at the schoolhouse door, blocking black children with state troopers and TV cameras rolling. Tonight on Faces of History, we're stepping into the mind of George Wallace, the Segregation Forever governor of Alabama. We'll follow him from a barefoot farm boy to the man who defied the federal government, who rode open racism to the national stage, and who, in the end, found himself trapped by the same fire he stoked. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave. Let's begin. Long before the Marble Dome in Montgomery, before the TV cameras, before the schoolhouse door, there was just Cleo, a patch of red Alabama dirt, cotton fields that drank sweat and rain, pine forests that whispered secrets in the wind. It was here, in 1919, that George Corley Wallace Jr. took his first breath, born into a world that would carve him as much as he carved it. Cleo was a town that taught you your place early. Black families picked cotton they'd never own, lived in shacks they'd never fix, worked fields they'd never inherit. White families like the Wallaces worked too, but they held on to the belief that, however poor they were at least above someone else. George's father, George Sr., scratched out a living as a farmer and sometimes politician. He wasn't wealthy, but he was shrewd. He knew every handshake was a seed planted. Every favor done was a vote harvested later. His father's name opened a few doors for young George, but it was George's own grit that kept them open. His mother, Moselle, was tough and warm in equal measure. She cooked, cleaned, and held the family together through the Depression's hunger and fear. For George, she was the backbone. Her pride in him ran deeper than the family's well. She expected him to aim high, no matter how low the family's bank account read. As a boy, George worked the fields beside black sharecroppers. He saw the same sun scorch black and white backs alike. He knew poverty firsthand: the thin soup for dinner, the secondhand shoes, the whispers about debts that never vanished. But he also knew, even as a child, that skin color drew a line in the red dirt. Who served whom, who moved aside on the sidewalk, who sat where in the crumbling courthouse. Jim Crow wasn't just a law, it was air, it was habit, it was unquestioned truth to a boy born under the Alabama sun. Small in stature but quick with his fists, George learned to fight young. He boxed at school, joined the debate team, ran for every class office he could. His classmates called him Scrappy, a talker, a kid who'd outwork you if he couldn't outmuscle you. He was the kind of boy who'd shake your hand, remember your mama's name, and then whip you in the ring that same afternoon. In the classroom, he found his real weapon, his tongue. George discovered early that words could move people the way fists couldn't. He could spin a joke, drop a folksy story, slip from charm to thunder in a heartbeat. Teachers noticed. So did local politicians. His father saw it too, the way people leaned in when George talked. He wasn't just another farm boy. He was a farm boy who wanted the courthouse, maybe more. At 15, Wallace left Cleo for the University of Alabama, a bold leap for a poor farm kid. He swept floors, waited tables, boxed for prize money, anything to pay tuition. In law school, he stayed up nights memorizing arguments, taking side jobs, charming professors and classmates alike. He wasn't the best student, but he was relentless, a word that would define him for the rest of his life. Between studies, he watched the currents of Alabama politics swirl. He saw old segregationists give flowery speeches on states' rights. He saw how a clever line and a firm handshake could win you a seat on the judge's bench or a place in the legislature. He watched young men flatter old power brokers. He learned that winning votes meant understanding fear and feeding it if you had to. When he graduated law school, he wasn't just George Wallace from Cleo anymore. He was George Wallace, Esquire, armed with a law degree, a chip on his shoulder, and a bottomless well of ambition. By the time he put on his army uniform in World War II, George Wallace knew exactly who he was. A poor farm boy who wanted to be somebody, and who would never let being small, broke, or underestimated stop him. The red dirt of Cleo stayed under his nails long after he swapped overalls for suits. It gave him his story, his anger, his grin. It gave him the raw clay he'd mold into the man who'd stand on the schoolhouse steps, defying presidents and crowds alike. Because before he could promise segregation forever, George Wallace first had to promise himself, I will never be nobody again. When George Wallace strode out of the University of Alabama's law school in the early 1940s, he carried two things: a shiny new law degree and a burning conviction that Clio's red clay wasn't big enough to hold him. The son of a farmer was about to become the judge of men. First, though, the world called. Like so many young men of his generation, George found himself swept into World War II. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps, trained as a flight engineer, and shipped off to the Pacific. In the belly of a B-29, he found himself shoulder to shoulder with boys from Chicago, Kansas, New York, men who'd never tasted boiled peanuts or sat through a Sunday sermon in a pine board church. The war gave him a broader stage, but it didn't broaden his views. Wallace never claimed to be a hero, but his military service would become another notch on his resume when he came home. Alabama respected its veterans, and Wallace knew respect was political currency. When the war ended, Wallace came home a decorated veteran, still short in stature but taller in ambition. He opened a modest law practice in Clayton, Alabama. He took on divorce cases, land disputes, petty crime, anything that kept him in court, in front of people, in the papers. And people liked him. Wallace had the same gift that would later fill stadiums. He made folks feel seen. He called black people boy and girl, like every other white man of his station. But if you needed a lawyer, he'd take your case if he thought it could help him later. He'd wink at white farmers and shake hands with the black laborers they underpaid. He understood that small favors built big loyalty. By 1946, George Wallace was ready for more than dusty law books and courthouse gossip. At just 27, he ran for a seat in the Alabama House of Representatives and won. Inside the state legislature, the farm boy from Clio became the smooth-talking country lawyer who worked every corner of the room. He championed roads for poor counties, pushed for textbooks for rural kids, railed against taxes that squeezed farmers. He called himself the little man's friend. And for a while, he meant it. His brand was pure Southern populism, anti-elite, pro-farmer for the common man. It was old Huey Long politics, stripped of the violence but dripping with the same fire. He learned quickly that the real power in Alabama didn't sit in the governor's mansion. It sat in the courthouse. So in 1952, at age 33, George Wallace ran for circuit judge of the 3rd Judicial Circuit. He won, of course. He'd already charmed the courthouse lawyers, the farmers, the mamas and daddies whose sons might stand before him. As a judge, Wallace built his legend. He drove the circuit in a beat-up car, ate potluck dinners with farm families, remembered every name and birthday. He made sure his courtroom felt like a place where the little man got a fair shake, so long as that little man was white. Yet it's true, and important to remember, that early Wallace wasn't the frothing segregationist he'd become. In fact, some black Alabamians quietly favored him over other judges who were openly vicious. The NAACP even backed him once for his reputation for courtesy toward black defendants, an irony lost to history's haze. But ambition doesn't care about kindness. It feeds on opportunity. Wallace saw that being fair didn't win elections in Alabama. Being tough did. Tough on crime, tough on labor unions, tough on anyone who threatened the old Southern order. In the early 50s, the Supreme Court began to crack segregation open. Brown v. Z Board of Education, 1954. Suddenly, separate but equal wasn't legal fiction anymore. It was doomed. Across the South, white men in suits sharpened their tongues for a fight. George Wallace paid attention. He read the winds blowing through his state's cotton fields and courthouse steps. He knew the South's greatest export wasn't just cotton anymore. It was defiance. In 1958, Wallace made his biggest gamble yet, governor of Alabama. He ran as a populist moderate, promising roads, better schools, fair courts. But in Alabama, the race card wasn't optional. It was the whole deck. His opponent, John Patterson, went all in. Backed by the Ku Klux Klan, he called Wallace soft on segregation. George Wallace lost, and he learned the lesson that would shape the rest of his life. Principles are a luxury for winners. If you want power, you take it on the terms the people demand. And the people of Alabama in 1958 demanded a champion of segregation. Standing in a smoke-filled back room after his defeat, George Wallace laid down his new gospel. "Boys," he said, "I was out in word, and I'll never be out in word again." The boxer from Clio was about to swing with both fists, and he wouldn't stop swinging until the whole nation heard the thud. In 1958, George Wallace had tasted the bitterest defeat of his young political life, beaten not by better ideas, but by a single word: segregation. He'd watched John Patterson stand hand in glove with the Ku Klux Klan, brandish white supremacy like a campaign poster, and ride that wave right past Wallace to the governor's chair. It humiliated him, but it taught him exactly what Alabama's white voters wanted most: a champion who wouldn't just defend the color line, but make it sacred. So Wallace went home to Clio and got to work. He called in his advisors, crusty courthouse operators, old political hands, slick young lawyers who could shape a phrase like a razor. He asked them one question: how do we make sure nobody ever out-segregates us again? They gave him the blueprint. Wallace provided the fire. He started with the image. The folksy, mild-mannered judge had to become something bigger, the bulldog who'd stand at the schoolhouse door and dare the federal government to knock him down. He started giving speeches dripping with defiance. States' rights, Southern pride, the right of white people to decide how they lived and who they lived beside. He didn't invent these lines. They were as old as the Confederacy, but he delivered them with a boxer's grin and a country preacher's thunder. And the crowds loved it. In mill towns and piney woods, at barbershops and barber colleges, Wallace promised that Washington bureaucrats would never tell Alabama what to do. Behind closed doors, Wallace was as calculating as ever. He hired speechwriters who knew just how far to push the language, enough to electrify white voters, but not so raw that national reporters would dismiss him as just another backwoods bigot. He wanted to be Alabama's hero, but also America's headline. By the time the 1962 election rolled around, Wallace was a man transformed. His campaign rallies were a spectacle. High school bands playing fight songs, banners flapping in the humid breeze, Wallace taking the stage in crisp suits, that trademark grin stretching from ear to ear. He didn't talk about roads or taxes anymore. He talked about them, the federal government, the civil rights agitators, the pointy-headed intellectuals who didn't know a plow from a pickaxe. He painted a picture of Alabama as a fortress under siege, and himself as the last man standing on the ramparts. The voters ate it up. On Election Day, Wallace crushed his opponents. When the final ballots were counted, the barefoot farm boy from Clio was Governor George Corley Wallace of Alabama, sworn to uphold the Constitution of his state and, more importantly, to uphold the invisible wall between black and white. His inaugural address would become infamous. January 14, 1963, a cold wind snapped the Confederate flags that dotted the crowd outside the Alabama state capitol. Wallace took the podium. Behind him loomed the same steps where Jefferson Davis had sworn his oath as President of the Confederacy a century before. Wallace knew the symbolism. He fed on it. He leaned into the microphone, paused for effect, then thundered the words that would cling to him for the rest of his life. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a shot fired at Washington, at civil rights activists, at history itself. The crowd roared, Confederate flags waved, old men wept. Wallace had branded himself forever, the defiant governor, the man who'd stand in the door. To white Alabamians who feared black progress, Wallace was their savior. To civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., he was the new face of the old hate. To the press, he was a spectacle, a contradiction, the smooth-talking, small-town judge who turned himself into a barricade against justice. But Wallace didn't care. He knew he was unstoppable now because he was giving his people exactly what they wanted, the illusion that the old order would never fall. Soon he'd put his promise to the test. The courts were pressing Alabama to desegregate its schools, starting with the flagship, the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, the federal government, armed with court orders and federal marshals. On the other, George Wallace, armed with a microphone, a camera crew, and the full weight of Alabama's segregationist rage. Wallace didn't invent racism, but now he was about to perform it for the world. He would stand at that schoolhouse door and dare the future to push him aside. It was June 11th, 1963. Summer in Tuscaloosa meant air so thick you could taste it. The tang of red clay dust, magnolia blooms, and sweat-soaked fear. By mid-morning, the campus of the University of Alabama pulsed with tension. Television trucks from New York and Chicago hummed beside dusty Alabama patrol cars. Reporters tested their microphones. Federal marshals leaned on their cars, arms folded, sunglasses hiding their eyes. And somewhere behind it all, two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, waited for a door to open. The door in question, Foster Auditorium, was just another brick building before that day. But on this morning, it would become a symbol burned into American memory. Inside, students and staff whispered, peering through dusty blinds at the crowds gathering outside. Alabama's young governor, George Wallace, had promised them a show, and Wallace never broke a promise when cameras were rolling. For Wallace, this was the moment he'd built since the night he lost the governorship 5 years earlier. He'd crafted every word of his inaugural speech for this. He'd sworn an oath to the segregationists, the white farmers, the mill workers who felt the world slipping away from them, that he would stand in the door and make the world stop. And here it was, a stand, a door, and two black students armed only with a court order and the righteousness of the Constitution. Vivian Malone and James Hood were not the kind of warriors Wallace had painted in his fiery speeches. They were calm, determined. Vivian, in a crisp dress, her hair neatly done, clutched her purse with a quiet steadiness that could break your heart if you knew what she faced. James Hood, taller and reserved, stood beside her like a pillar of patience. They weren't armed, they weren't loud, they had no mobs. All they had was the law and their feet, ready to walk through a door their grandparents could never dream of touching. Waiting for them at the top of the steps was George Wallace, flanked by Alabama state troopers. He wore his best dark suit, hair slicked back, grin fixed in place like a mask. His hands rested on a piece of paper, a prepared statement for the cameras. For Wallace, this wasn't just defiance. This was performance. He knew the images would ricochet from Alabama's dusty campus to television sets in Harlem, Los Angeles, and London. He wanted every white voter in America to see him standing there, a lone man against the tide. On the other side stood the federal government. President John F. Kennedy, already tangled in the messy struggle of civil rights, had sent his deputy, Nicholas Katzenbach, a lean lawyer with wire-rimmed glasses and the weight of the presidency on his shoulders. With him were U.S. Marshals and the Alabama National Guard, federalized just hours earlier under Kennedy's order. Katzenbach stepped forward, sweat beading under his collar, his voice steady but sharp. "Governor Wallace, it is my duty to ask you to step aside under the orders of the United States District Court to permit these students to enroll." Wallace didn't flinch. He read his speech like a man reading scripture. The unwelcomed, unwanted, unwarranted, and force-induced intrusion upon the campus of the University of Alabama is a direct violation of the Constitution of the state of Alabama. He droned on about states' rights, about tyranny, about the sanctity of our way of life. He turned to the cameras when he could, the whole stand choreographed like an old vaudeville act for segregation's final gasp. Inside, Malone and Hood waited in a car with federal marshals, their nerves calm, but their hearts pounding. They knew this moment could end with them walking through the door or carried away on stretchers. In Mississippi the year before, James Meredith had faced mobs of screaming segregationists at Ole Miss. Shots had rung out, blood had stained the campus. Wallace wanted no blood, just the spectacle. In the end, the old ways cracked without a gun fired. After Wallace gave his grand performance, President Kennedy ordered the Alabama National Guard to enforce the court order. General Henry Graham, helmet under his arm, stepped up the stairs, saluted Wallace, and told him flatly, "Sir, it is my sad duty to ask you to step aside." Wallace blinked. He looked at the cameras, his true audience, and saw what he needed. He'd made his stand. He'd be immortal in the eyes of white Alabama. He stepped aside. The door opened. Vivian Malone and James Hood walked inside. They didn't look back. They didn't have to. They carried history on their shoulders like a quiet crown. Inside the auditorium, they signed their enrollment papers. Just two students at a registrar's desk. A moment so ordinary it belied the extraordinary courage it took to get there. Outside, Wallace stepped away from the steps but into legend. He lost the skirmish, but he'd won the headline. That night, his defiance was broadcast on every major network. To the rest of America, he was the face of Southern bigotry. To his base, he was the man who stood up when others knelt. The stand in the schoolhouse door launched Wallace from a regional sideshow to a national figure. His message, wrapped in coded states' rights talk, resonated not just with Alabama farmers, but with factory workers in Detroit and Boston who felt the world changing too fast. The door had opened, but Wallace had found another one to walk through, the door to national power. In the coming years, he would pass through that door again and again, each time with a new slogan, a new grin, and the same old poison. George Wallace lost the fight at the schoolhouse door, but he'd found something far bigger than a single building in Tuscaloosa. He'd found a stage. By 1963, television was the new church of American politics, and Wallace understood its gospel better than most. The image of him standing in that doorway, squaring his small frame against federal power, made him a hero in the eyes of millions of white Americans who felt the world was tilting out of their hands. The country was changing fast, too fast for some. Factories were closing up north, sending good-paying jobs overseas or down south where unions were weak. Black Americans were demanding seats at lunch counters like spots in schools, votes in ballot boxes they'd been denied for generations. Cities like Detroit and Newark erupted in riots, the rage of decades burning through brick and asphalt. And in their living rooms, white Americans watched it all on TV, the protests, the violence, the marches led by Martin Luther King Jr., and shouted down by men like Wallace. To some, King was a hero. To others, Wallace was. Wallace saw it all, and he saw an opportunity that stretched far beyond Alabama's borders. In 1964, he dipped his toe in the national waters, running as a write-in candidate in a few Democratic primaries outside the South. The results startled the political class. In Wisconsin, Indiana, and Maryland, thousands of northern white voters pulled the lever for Wallace. They liked his talk of law and order. They liked his promise to stand up to Washington. And though he didn't say segregation outright anymore, they heard the echoes in every line. By 1968, America was burning, and Wallace knew it was his moment. King was assassinated in April on a Memphis balcony. Robert F. Kennedy was shot in June in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen. The Vietnam War was tearing the country in half. College students in helmets on one side, working-class men in uniform on the other. Wallace announced he'd run for president as an independent, no longer just the Alabama governor, but the self-appointed voice of ordinary Americans fed up with protests, riots, and what he called pointy-headed intellectuals in Washington. His new slogan, "Stand Up for America." The crowds came. They packed high school gyms in Michigan and hockey arenas in Wisconsin. Factory workers in Boston, cab drivers in Baltimore, small farmers in Arkansas. They cheered when Wallace spat venom at the liberal press, when he mocked student protesters as unwashed hippies. His stump speeches were half sermon, half street fight. He called demonstrators anarchists and bums. He promised to run the country like I run Alabama, with a strong hand. Sometimes his audiences roared back uglier things: racial slurs, calls for violence, jeers at reporters who asked him about civil rights. Wallace didn't have to say the words segregation forever anymore. His crowd said it for him, in code or out loud. But Wallace was smart enough to broaden his pitch. He talked crime. He talked inflation. He raged against judges who coddled criminals and bureaucrats who wasted your tax dollars. He attacked busing, the court-ordered plan to integrate schools by sending white children to black schools and vice versa. In places like Boston, the backlash to busing was fierce, and Wallace rode that anger like a wave. When the ballots were counted that November, Wallace did what no third-party candidate has done since. He won 5 states outright, all in the Deep South, and carried nearly 10 million votes nationwide. He didn't win the White House, but he won something just as enduring. He showed that raw, coded racism, wrapped in law and order, states' rights, and family values, could find fertile ground far beyond Alabama's dusty roads. He showed future politicians how fear could be packaged, sold, and voted into power. His blueprint didn't die with him. It evolved. And yet, Wallace wasn't finished. In 1972, he launched another run, this time within the Democratic Party itself. He hoped to peel off enough disaffected working class white Democrats to snatch the nomination from the establishment. It was working until a gunman's bullet stopped him cold in a Laurel, Maryland parking lot. But that part of the story, the bullet, the wheelchair, the reckoning, that comes next. By 1972, George Wallace was a political machine running on fumes and fury. Older now, more polished, but still feeding on the same raw nerve that had carried him from Clio's cotton fields to national headlines. That spring, and he was once again crisscrossing the country, rally after rally, factory gate after factory gate, pitching himself as the real Democrat, the only one who'd stand up to criminals, hippies, bureaucrats, and the growing swirl of social change that frightened so many of the white working class. His crowds were bigger than ever. Union men in Pittsburgh, factory hands in Detroit, angry homeowners in Boston, all clapping for the Alabama governor, who told them he'd stand in their door too. He was doing well enough in the primaries that pundits were whispering, if no one locks this up, Wallace could throw the whole thing into chaos. He grinned when he heard it. Chaos was George Wallace's oxygen. Then came May 15th, 1972. It was a hot, sticky Monday in Laurel, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. Wallace was scheduled to speak at a shopping center. The Laurel Shopping Center, surrounded by chain stores and cars glinting in the sun. It was a routine campaign stop. Short speech, some handshakes, maybe a headline in the next day's paper. But in the crowd that day stood a young man named Arthur Bremer, 21, pale, drifting through life like a loose spark looking for tinder. Bremer didn't care about Wallace's politics. He didn't care about anything, really. He wanted to be famous. Killing a presidential candidate, he figured, would do it. The speech was short, Wallace's usual red meat about crime and bussing. Then he waded into the crowd. He shook hands, flashed that grin, leaned in close so people could see the sweat on his forehead, the sparkle of the old fight in his eyes. Someone thrust a baby forward. Wallace kissed it. He looked up, and that's when Bremer stepped forward. 4 shots. In an instant, Wallace crumpled, the roar of the crowd turning from cheers to screams. Secret Service agents tackled Bremer, but the damage was done. Bullets had ripped into Wallace's abdomen, chest, and spine. In a hospital bed, George Wallace woke up to the news. He would live, but never walk again. The boxer from Clio, the fighter who had stood in schoolhouse doors and campaign stages across the country, was paralyzed from the waist down. He would spend the rest of his days in a wheelchair. His presidential run was over in an instant, but the image of him, strapped to that chair, smiling through gritted teeth, never left the American mind. For Wallace, the bullet was more than just physical punishment. It forced a reckoning. He sat alone, strapped into metal braces, staring out the window at hospital lawns and his own reflection in TV screens. He'd spent decades using fear and hate as fuel. Now he had time, endless time, to consider what it had cost him and what it had cost others. His body broken, Wallace reached for something no one expected from the once smirking face of segregation, an apology. In the years that followed, George Wallace spoke words no one in Alabama ever thought they'd hear. He invited black leaders to the governor's mansion. He asked for forgiveness, privately and sometimes publicly, from the very people he had once scorned. He told crowds that he had been wrong, that segregation was wrong. Some believed him, many did not. Some called it cynical politics. He needed black votes to stay in office during his final terms as governor. Others saw a man genuinely haunted by the door he had stood in front of, the doors he had slammed shut for so many for so long. In the 1980s and 90s, black Alabamians sometimes wheeled Wallace onto church stages. There he sat, small and pale in his wheelchair, the fire gone from his voice, but still flickering in his eyes. He talked about pain, not just the pain of the bullet, but the pain he'd inflicted. He asked for hands to reach out, and sometimes they did. It didn't erase the schoolhouse door. It didn't fill the empty desks, mend the broken hearts, or wipe away the signs that read whites only. But it was something, and sometimes something is all a broken old man can offer. George Wallace died in 1998, 79 years old, worn down by Parkinson's, old injuries, and the weight of his own history. He died in Montgomery, the same city where he had once sworn segregation forever. When he passed, some wept, some shrugged, some remembered him as a monster in a suit. Others, mostly older black citizens of Alabama, debated whether to forgive or forget. In the end, Wallace left behind a complicated ghost, a man who rode racism to power, who outlived the hate he helped feed, and who spent his final years trying, too late for many, to outrun his own shadow. What does that say about America? That sometimes our monsters don't wear hoods. They wear suits. They smile for cameras. They stand in doorways. And sometimes, if the bullet or the truth catches up to them, they ask for forgiveness. And we, who remember the doors they closed, have to decide if we open one more or leave them on the steps. When George Corley Wallace finally left this world in 1998, the people of Alabama gathered in the muggy stillness of Montgomery to bury a man who had outlived the fire he once stoked. They wheeled his flag-draped coffin up the marble steps of the Alabama State Capitol, the same steps where he'd thundered, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Some came to mourn, some came to make sure he was really gone. His grave marker sits in a quiet cemetery in Montgomery. Simple, plain. A stone for a man who had never been simple or plain a day in his life. Around him, the ghosts of the Confederacy and civil rights swirl in the southern air, reminders that in Alabama, history never stays buried for long. So what is George Wallace's legacy? Is it the Schoolhouse Door ads and the black and white newsreels, the defiant stand that became shorthand for Southern defiance? Or is it the George Wallace who wheeled himself into black churches in his final years, whispering, "I'm sorry," to mothers and fathers whose children had faced jeers and fists because of the path he paved? Historians debate it. Some say Wallace was the last gasp of old Dixie racism, the final showman of segregation, rendered irrelevant by the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the unstoppable march of history. But others, and maybe they're closer to the truth, see Wallace as something more dangerous, a pioneer of a new kind of politics, a master of coded language. A man who took the raw poison of hate, polished it up with folksy humor and populist anger, and sold it not just to Alabama farmers, but to working class whites from Boston to Bakersfield. He didn't invent dog whistles, but he perfected them. States' rights, law and order, family values. Wallace taught America how to say segregation without saying it, how to turn race into an invisible fence that didn't need to stand in the schoolhouse door anymore, because it stood in neighborhoods, voting booths, and the quiet nods of the powerful. His blueprint didn't die with him. Decades later, politicians in fine suits still echo Wallace's tricks: pit neighbor against neighbor, paint the press as the enemy, promise the past can come back if we just slam the right doors shut. The crowds still cheer, the slogans change, the fear stays the same. And yet, there's the other Wallace, too. The Wallace who spent his final days rolling into black churches, leaning over to grasp hands he'd once condemned to the back of the bus. Some accepted his apology, some refused. Both reactions are true, and neither can erase the damage. His children, literal and political, still live among us. The farmers who remember him fondly for the roads and schools he built, the civil rights veterans who remember him for the fire hoses and police dogs his defiance encouraged. Sometimes history hands us easy monsters, villains with no regrets, no second acts. George Wallace isn't that clean. He is the story of a man who made himself a symbol of hate, then tried to outrun it once the cameras turned away. His apology does not wash away the doors he closed, but it lingers, an uneasy echo that history doesn't always tie up its loose ends. If you drive through Clio today, you'll find a sign that says, "Home of George C. Wallace." Some see that as a point of pride, some see it as a warning. Maybe it's both. When we talk about George Wallace, we're not just talking about a man in a wheelchair, or a governor in a suit, or a boy who pulled cotton from Alabama's red earth. We're talking about the America that let him rise, and the parts of America that keep him alive today, every time fear is packaged as patriotism. So next time you see a politician smiling in a suit, talking about taking our country back, listen close. Sometimes the ghost of George Wallace is standing right there behind them, grinning that same old grin. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, history doesn't just live in the past. Sometimes it's waiting at the door. If you learned something tonight, share this story, subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends. Faces of History doesn't just teach, it remembers the faces we'd rather forget.